How's it going, everyone? It's Noir back with another video. Today I want to talk about 3 different types of sampling. This is just 3 general ways to sample. I'm sure these have been covered in many other videos. I'm not going to break them down into extreme detail, but I'm going to give examples and give you a definition. You should be able to take it from there. So let's get right into it. No point in speaking too much about it. Let's dive right into the first one, which is looping. So this is probably the oldest form of sampling. Just taking a loop out of a song, looping it over and over and over, adding drums, adding other elements, and calling it a day. Probably the quickest workflow too. Definitely something you can rely on if you're in studio with an artist and need to make something quickly. Today I just had an example. I may have to put some effects over this in post because of copyright, but this is the sample I used here, and this is the section I used as well to loop to make the beat. And so in this example, all I did was loop it up. I added drums and I added a bass line, pretty simple bass line, and then here we go. So it's pretty simple there. Oldest way to sample. If you haven't heard about this before, you might be pretty new to music production in this sort of style, and that's okay. Welcome to the world of sampling. Anyways, that's number 1, looping. Easy. Number 2, we're getting a little bit more complicated. This is number 2. It's just chopping. Another pretty standard sampling technique. I did get a little bit more complicated with this one. Instead of just chopping the sample and calling it a day, I used a sample chop and I played with the pitch a little bit to create a bit of variation, which is okay. I still count it as chopping because I took a portion of the sample. So this is the sample chop I used. It came from a much larger sample, which I chopped up into a few pieces. It was a very simple chop, nothing crazy going on here. Just a small part of the sample, and I played it with 16 levels to create a pitch variation. So this is the pattern I came up with. I should add just before we get to sampling technique number 3, if you're enjoying the content so far and getting any helpful advice out of it, please feel free to like and subscribe. Making these sort of videos does take a lot more editing than my standard videos, and I love learning the stuff and love learning techniques and spending more time video editing, etc. But it's learning all this new stuff that you always hit a brick wall and you have to push past it. Liking and subscribing definitely shows results, and that just pushes me to the next level, that's for sure. And if you're getting any helpful advice as well, feel free to comment and let me know. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them too. So sampling technique number 3, I just called it one shot. This is becoming quite popular in the trap / new generation of producers. All the producers who are making loops and not so much focused on the beats. It's quite common for them to take a small sample and then just repitch it and make a new layer. And I call it one shots. They also use this term for just the sound of a bell, a sample of a bell or something. But what's important to know about this technique is you can't just use the sample and repitch it. You have to use filters, you have to add effects to really make it sound good. If you just repitch the sample without doing anything to it, it's going to sound a bit clunky. And if you haven't warped it, when you repitch it, the length of the sample is going to change too. So it's important to know all these different things if you start using one shots. So what I did is I approached this sample and I chopped it up. And so I think I only used this chop here. And it's up to you whether you add the effects beforehand or after. I usually love adding effects beforehand because it allows me to sort of place how I want it to sound much easier. Let's say you're making a lo-fi beat and everything sounds old and dusty, and then you come in with a new sample, like a new jazz song. It sounds really polished and it doesn't fit in. And trying to create a melody with something that doesn't fit in can be difficult, particularly I find for me. So sometimes I like to dusty up the sound and filter it before I even create the melody. Anyways, this time I didn't do that though. This time I just came in and made the melody over the drums, and then I bounced it. I should also mention the reason all of these are on the first track and they're all muted, I bounced these all. So those are the bass lines, and these are the sampling techniques that I did. I just bounced them into samples, put them on the first track, and here's the drums here. So I recorded the melody with the one shot, and then I bounced it, and I added some effects. This is what I created. It's so crazy. When I came into this video trying to show off the 3 different sampling techniques, it's just so wild that you can have the same drums and the same bass. Granted, it's got individual bass patterns for each individual sampling technique, but still, it's the same drums and the same bass. And with the different sampling techniques, these are 3 totally different beats. It's wild. But anyways, thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something. If you're new here, please feel free to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time,